I've been completely obsessed with the Tang Dynasty for months now, and I honestly think it's the most fascinating period in all of world history. Like, I started reading about it for a history class, but then I just kept going deeper and deeper into the research because every single aspect of this dynasty is absolutely mind-blowing. We're talking about an empire that lasted from 618 to 907 CE and represented China at its absolute peak of power, cultural achievement, and international influence. The whole thing started when this guy Li Yuan, who later became Emperor Gaozu, basically seized power during the chaos at the end of the Sui dynasty. The Sui had been this brief but intense dynasty that reunified China after centuries of division, but they overextended themselves with massive construction projects like the Grand Canal and disastrous military campaigns against Korea. When the Sui Emperor Yang was assassinated in 618, Li Yuan saw his chance and took it. But here's the thing that really gets me. Li Yuan wasn't even the most important founder of the dynasty. That honor goes to his son Li Shimin, who became Emperor Taizong and is basically one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. Taizong was this incredible combination of military genius and administrative reformer. He spent the early years of his reign conquering and consolidating territory, but what made him special was how he transformed conquest into stable governance. He created this whole system of government that balanced different power centers against each other, so that no single group could threaten imperial authority. The military was kept separate from civilian administration. Regional governors were rotated frequently to prevent them from building local power bases, and the central government maintained tight control over appointments and promotions. But the bureaucracy he established was also remarkably meritocratic for its time. The civil service examination system that became so central to Chinese governance really took off under Taizong. Theoretically, any man with sufficient education could take these exams and rise through the ranks based on talent rather than birth. In practice, it still favored the wealthy who could afford years of classical education, but it was still way more open than the hereditary aristocratic systems that dominated most other countries. These exams tested knowledge of classical literature, poetry, composition, and administrative theory, creating an educated bureaucratic class that shared common cultural values and administrative techniques. The capital city of Chang'an during the Tang period was absolutely insane. We're talking about a planned city with over 1 million inhabitants, making it almost certainly the largest city in the world at the time. The urban planning was based on this cosmic geometry, where the imperial palace sat at the north end like the North Star, and everything else was arranged in perfect geometric order around it. The main north-south avenue was over 500 feet wide, broader than most modern highways, and the entire city was laid out in a grid pattern with designated areas for different social classes, foreign merchants, markets, entertainment districts, and religious institutions. What really blows my mind about Chang'an is how incredibly diverse it was. This wasn't just a Chinese city, it was this massive cosmopolitan hub where you had merchants, diplomats, students, and adventurers from literally all over the known world. There were Persians running businesses, Arab traders dealing in spices and precious goods, Turkish military officers serving in the imperial army, Korean and Japanese students studying Chinese classics, Indian Buddhist monks teaching in temples, and even occasional visitors from as far away as the Byzantine Empire. The western market of Chang'an was apparently like walking through a bazaar that connected China to the entire rest of Asia and beyond. The military expansion during the early Tang period was absolutely phenomenal. At its peak around 660 CE, the empire stretched from Korea in the northeast all the way to parts of present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan in the west. They controlled virtually all of the Silk Road trade routes, which meant they were collecting taxes and tribute from merchants traveling between China and Central Asia, India, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. This made them incredibly wealthy and gave them enormous soft power influence throughout Asia. The tributary system they established was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to directly administer distant territories, they created this network of client states that acknowledged Chinese supremacy and sent regular tribute missions to Chang'an. In return, these states received Chinese protection, access to Chinese markets, and the prestige that came with imperial recognition. Countries like Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and various Central Asian kingdoms were all part of this system at different times. It was a way of projecting power and influence without the massive costs of direct occupation and administration. But then you get to Wutian, and her story is just absolutely wild. She started as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong, but she was clearly incredibly intelligent and ambitious. When Taizong died, she somehow managed to catch the attention of his son and successor, Emperor Gaozong. Through a combination of political skill, ruthless elimination of rivals, and probably genuine administrative ability, she gradually accumulated more and more power. When Gaozong died in 683, she initially ruled as regent for her young sons, but in 690, she took the unprecedented step of declaring herself emperor, not empress, but emperor of her own dynasty. The fact that Wutian managed to become the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right is absolutely incredible when you consider the cultural constraints she was working against. Traditional Chinese political theory held that women were fundamentally unsuited for political power, and the entire Confucian ideological system emphasized male authority and female subordination. But Wutian basically smashed through all of these barriers through sheer force of will and political genius. She promoted talented officials regardless of their social background, expanded the civil service examination system, continued the military expansion of the empire, and maintained internal stability for nearly 2 decades. Traditional Chinese historians were pretty harsh on Wutian because she violated all their assumptions about proper gender roles and legitimate authority. They portrayed her as a usurper who gained power through sexual manipulation and maintained it through terror and murder. Modern historians have a much more balanced view. Yes, she could be ruthless when necessary, but so could male emperors, and her actual record of governance was quite impressive. She expanded educational opportunities, promoted religious tolerance, and continued the cultural and economic prosperity that characterized the early Tang period. The cultural achievements during the Tang dynasty were just off the charts. This is when Chinese poetry reached its absolute pinnacle, with figures like Li Bai and Du Fu, who are still considered the greatest Chinese poets of all time over 1,000 years later. Li Bai was this romantic, almost bohemian figure who wrote with incredible lyrical beauty about nature, friendship, wine, and the transient nature of human life. His poems have this effortless, flowing quality that makes them seem almost spontaneous, but they're actually incredibly sophisticated in their use of imagery, rhythm, and allusion to classical literature. Du Fu was completely different in style and temperament. Where Li Bai was romantic and carefree, Du Fu was serious, socially conscious, and deeply concerned with moral and political issues. His poems deal with war, poverty, social injustice, and the suffering of ordinary people with remarkable depth and complexity. He lived through the Anlucan Rebellion and wrote some of the most powerful war poetry in any language about the devastation and human cost of that conflict. Both poets are still memorized by Chinese students today, and their influence on later Chinese literature is immeasurable. But it wasn't just poetry. Tang achievements in painting, sculpture, music, and decorative arts were equally impressive. Tang painters developed landscape painting techniques that influenced East Asian art for centuries. Their figure paintings, especially the portraits of court ladies and foreign merchants, show incredible technical skill and attention to cultural detail. The famous Tang 3-color glazed ceramics were traded all across Asia and are still considered masterpieces of ceramic art. Their metalworking was so advanced that they were producing steel that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The religious situation during the Tang period was fascinating and really shows how confident and secure the dynasty was. Buddhism was hugely popular and received massive imperial patronage. Emperors sponsored the construction of enormous temple complexes, funded the translation of thousands of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese, and supported Buddhist educational institutions. The famous monk Xuanzang traveled all the way to India to collect Buddhist scriptures, and his journey became the basis for the classic novel Journey to the West. But at the same time, Taoism was also thriving, partly because the Tang imperial family claimed descent from Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoism. Even more remarkably, foreign religions were allowed to establish communities and build places of worship. There were Zoroastrian fire temples, Manichaean churches, Nestorian Christian communities, and Islamic mosques all operating openly in Tang territory. This kind of religious pluralism was pretty unusual for the medieval world and shows how cosmopolitan and tolerant Tang society was at its peak. The technological innovations during this period were incredible. They invented woodblock printing, which revolutionized the spread of knowledge and literature. The Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 CE, is the world's earliest dated printed book. They also made major advances in metallurgy, developing new techniques for producing steel and iron that made their weapons and tools superior to those of neighboring countries. Their agricultural technology improved dramatically with better plows, irrigation systems, and crop rotation techniques that supported a much larger population. The Silk Road trade during the Tang period was absolutely massive and connected China to literally the entire known world. Chinese silk, tea, porcelain, and spices were in demand everywhere from Japan to the Middle East to Europe. But the trade wasn't just one way. They were importing horses from Central Asia, precious stones from India, glassware from the Islamic world, ivory from Africa, and all sorts of exotic goods that made the empire even wealthier and more cosmopolitan. The archaeological evidence from Silk Road sites shows artifacts from dozens of different cultures all mixed together, really demonstrating how interconnected the medieval world was. The government system they developed was incredibly sophisticated and became the model for East Asian governance for centuries. The central government was organized into different departments: the Department of State Affairs, the Imperial Secretariat, the Imperial Chancellery, that handled different aspects of administration while checking each other's power. Below that, there was a complex provincial system with governors, prefects, and county magistrates, all appointed by the central government and subject to regular inspection and rotation. Women during the Tang period had significantly more freedom and higher status than they would have in later Chinese dynasties. Wutian is the most extreme example, but even ordinary upper-class women could own property, initiate divorce, participate in social and cultural activities, and receive education. Tang art and literature portrays women as elegant, educated, and socially active, rather than just as secluded domestic figures. Female poets like Yu Xuanji and Shuetao were celebrated literary figures, and women participated actively in religious life as nuns, temple patrons, and pilgrims. The diversity of Tang society is really striking when you look at the archaeological evidence. Tomb paintings and sculptures show people of all different ethnic backgrounds: Chinese, Central Asian, Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, all interacting as part of normal daily life. The clothing styles, hairstyles, and cultural practices shown in Tang art reflect this incredible mixing of different traditions. Even the imperial court employed officials and military officers from various ethnic backgrounds, showing how meritocratic and inclusive the system could be. The Anlucan Rebellion from 755 to 763 was the turning point that began the dynasty's decline, and it's a fascinating case study in how even the most powerful empires can suddenly fall apart. Anlucan was a general of Sogdian and Turkish ancestry who had gained enormous power and influence at court. He controlled 3 military districts on the northeastern frontier and commanded an army of over 160,000 troops. For reasons that historians still debate, personal ambition, ethnic resentment, genuine grievances against the government, he launched a massive rebellion that quickly overran much of northern China and captured both Chang'an and Luoyang. The rebellion lasted 8 years and was incredibly destructive. Millions of people died, either in the fighting itself or from the famines and epidemics that followed. The imperial government was forced to rely on foreign troops, Tibetans, Arabs, Uyghurs, to help suppress the rebellion, which further weakened central authority. Even after Anlucan was killed by his own son and the rebellion was finally put down, the Tang dynasty never really recovered its former strength and unity. After the Anlucan Rebellion, regional warlords started asserting more independence from central control. The equal field system of land distribution broke down, leading to increased inequality and social tension. The government became increasingly corrupt and ineffective, with powerful families and eunuch factions fighting for influence at court. Military expenses skyrocketed as the government tried to maintain control over rebellious provinces, straining the imperial treasury and forcing heavy taxation. The final blow came with the Huang Chow Rebellion from 874 to 884, which was essentially a massive peasant uprising that swept across southern China before marching north to capture Chang'an. Huang Chow was a failed examination candidate who became a salt merchant and eventually a bandit leader. His rebellion tapped into widespread discontent with government corruption, heavy taxation, and social inequality. When his forces captured Chang'an, they massacred thousands of foreign merchants and residents, effectively ending the cosmopolitan character that had made the Tang capital so remarkable. Even though the Huangchao Rebellion was eventually defeated, it left the dynasty fatally weakened. The last Tang emperors were basically powerless figureheads controlled by military strongmen. Regional warlords carved up the empire into independent kingdoms, and central authority collapsed entirely. The dynasty finally ended in 907, when the last emperor was forced to abdicate, leading to the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period that lasted until the Song dynasty reunified China in 960. What's really striking to me is how the Tang dynasty influenced not just China, but the entire East Asian cultural sphere in ways that are still visible today. Japan's Heian period culture was heavily modeled on Tang examples. Japanese architecture, poetry, government institutions, and even city planning were all based on Tang models. Korea adopted Tang governmental systems, legal codes, and Buddhist practices. Vietnam incorporated Tang administrative structures and literary traditions. The influence spread even further, with Tang cultural forms reaching Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East through trade and diplomatic contact. The archaeological evidence from Tang sites is absolutely incredible and really brings this ancient world to life. The tomb paintings from places like Dunhuang and Xi'an show this amazingly diverse society with people from all different ethnic backgrounds, wearing various styles of clothing and engaged in all sorts of activities. Merchants trading, musicians performing, diplomats presenting gifts, soldiers marching, farmers working, nobles hunting. The artifacts include everything from Central Asian horses to Middle Eastern glassware to Indian jewelry to African ivory, really showing how internationally connected this empire was. One thing that really struck me in my research is how the Tang dynasty represents this unique moment in Chinese history, when the country was simultaneously the most powerful in the world and also the most open to foreign influence and cultural exchange. Later, Chinese dynasties, especially the Ming and Qing, became much more inward-looking and suspicious of foreign contact. But during the Tang period, being cosmopolitan and internationally minded was seen as a sign of sophistication and power rather than cultural contamination. The legacy of the Tang dynasty in Chinese culture today is enormous and really shows how powerful historical memory can be. Chinese people still refer to overseas Chinese communities as Tang people and Chinatowns as Tang towns. The period represents this golden age of Chinese civilization, when everything seemed possible and China was unquestionably at the center of the known world. It's this powerful cultural memory of a time when China was the most advanced, powerful, and culturally influential civilization on Earth, and that memory still shapes Chinese national identity and international ambitions today. Looking at the Tang dynasty from a modern perspective, it's striking how many of the challenges they faced are still relevant today. Managing a diverse, multi-ethnic empire, balancing central authority with regional autonomy, dealing with economic inequality and social mobility, maintaining military security while promoting trade and cultural exchange, integrating foreign immigrants and minorities into the broader society. Their solutions weren't always perfect, and the dynasty ultimately fell, but their achievements in creating a stable, prosperous, and culturally vibrant society lasted for nearly 3 centuries, which is pretty remarkable by any historical standard, and still offers lessons for contemporary policymakers and leaders.